In the modern day, I'd say Pink is the perfect example of a pop star that I would say I admire more than I would say I liked. Mainly because however much I appreciate how she commanded the chart in her rock days, when rock actually had a presence on the charts, but since I've been following the pop charts, she's refined her image into something that fits a lot more cleanly into the pop scene today, while still being able to deliver some killer sing your heart out anthems that are pretty much the closest you get to pop rock in the mainstream today. But it was one such song, the lead single to this new album, Hurts to Be Human, called Walk Me Home, which made me intrigued by the potential of an album like this. Everything that was leading up to the release of this album, including the title itself, suggested that Pink was going in a very specific direction. It was suggested that this was the album where Pink's insecurities, humanities, concerns with the world around her would become more of a focus of the text. But while I thought Pink was unlikely to produce an album quite that bad, she's probably a better songwriter than Jess Glynne after all, I was concerned that it could potentially fall into similar territory, into that same very pandering territory that album fell into. But, as I've already alluded to, I do think Pink is a good songwriter, even if she is working with the likes of Dan Reynolds, Julia Michaels, Ryan Tedder, Max Martin, Shellback on this album. I had the hope that she'd at least be able to write some good pop tunes. And seeing Chris Stapleton on the list of featured artists was a pleasant surprise, and so what did we get on Hurts to Be Human? We got one of the messiest pile-ups of pop tones and textures that I may have ever heard in pop music. Seriously, if you thought that Pink would at least deliver a instrumentally cohesive album that flowed nicely from song to song that you could just have in the background, yeah, well, she certainly doesn't deliver on that front. Now, all that being said, I am convinced that there are some pretty excellent pop songs on this album, which do more than enough to hold this album out of mediocrity and into more passable territory, mainly because of Pink's songwriting more than anything else. And I am pretty convinced that there is a baseline of quality that Pink does meet on this album, but at the same time, I don't think I've heard a more messy and incohesive album that sounds as bizarrely calculated as this one since the aforementioned Jess Glynne album Always in Between. And that begs the question of where do we even start when discussing an album like this? And the best place to start is probably the only consistent element of this album, and that's Pink herself and her vocals. And believe me when I say this, she pretty much single-handedly saves this album from flying completely off the rails from start to finish, both in her songwriting and in her performances. And over such a variety of production styles, the fact that she holds her own across the entirety of this album is undoubtedly a testament to her skills as a performer. Whenever she's required to show a more vulnerable side on Love Me Anyway and My Attic, she's more than convincing, with the excellent Circle Game being the greatest example of Pink as an emotive performer on this album. Seriously, the way she sings on that song is just incredible. But every now and again you get a song like Hustle, where she's required to have a little bit more swagger, a little more attitude in her vocals, and I can't help but think that Dua Lipa might have just beaten her to the post on this occasion in terms of being that female pop artist in the mainstream who's able to bring that kind of swagger and attitude. I just think of songs like IDGAF. I suppose it's no surprise I'm making this comparison because Dua Lipa started out in her career making covers of Pink songs. It's almost no surprise that she's very much taken that role that once upon a time Pink once occupied in the mainstream. But that's nitpicking, and Pink's ability to command pop songs like Walk Me Home, Can We Pretend, We Could Have It All, and Courage make up for a lot. Although why the producers chose to lather her voice in quite that much autotune or Hey Why Miss You Sometime is utterly beyond me. And that leads into a big issue with this album. It's not so much Pink herself, but the material that she's given to deliver over the production. Certainly the element of the album that I find most messy and incohesive. Hustle sounds like exactly what I would expect Dan Reynolds thinks a Pink song sounds like. No surprise he has a writing credit on that track. And I'm really not a fan of those painfully fake grating horns on that song. But I'd probably take them over the clumsily integrated hip-hop and trap elements of the title track, which utterly destroy any swell that more organic touches to the instrumentation are built on the verses with that guitar that sounds really good. And then you get the lumbering percussion over melody approach to Courage, which sounds like something Sia would reject and certainly not something she would have contributed to. But the tension of that song is utterly obliterated by the decision in the production to layer this murky robotic vocal layer into the main vocal line, significantly dehumanizing the performance of both Pink and Rabel. Kind of staggering when you think of the amount of names that are attached to this project that mistakes could have seeped through like this. But to be fair, there are moments of the production that do work. I mean, I've already talked about Hustle, but the organ on the bridge there was a pretty nice touch. Similar case to the funky edge of Hey Why I Miss You Sometime, which surprisingly ended up pretty catchy. And that's before you get the genuine pop rock songs on this album, like Walk You Home and We Could Have It All, the latter of which I would argue is the one moment where we get a true snippet into how a pop rock Pink, think circa 2006, might fit into a modern context of today's mainstream. If you're willing to look for it, I think you'll find there's actually quite a lot to like about the production here, even if it is a total mess. But then you get the excellent Cash produced song Can We Pretend, with its pounding synths and colourful hook. Sounds like something that might have even charted on the Hot 100 in the early 2010s, and that's high praise indeed. And once again, it's a point I made earlier, but I will reiterate this, the fact that Pink is as comfortable in this wide variety of instrumental contexts is, once again, I will state again, a testament to her skills as a performer. I mean, it doesn't really help in terms of instrumental cohesion, but she's making the best out of a bad situation is what I'm saying. Furthermore, even ballads like the pretty damn good Love Me Anyway, that might sound more out of place in the hands of a more inexperienced performer, Pink is able to capture that feeling just effortlessly. Especially playing opposite Chris Stapleton, with his haggard, slightly older sounding vocal delivery, proving the perfect balance for Pink's more vulnerable side. The pair of them really sound as good as ever on that track. But now we need to get to the songwriting and the thematic arc of this album. And for a songwriter as experienced as Pink, I think while she does succeed in isolated moments across this album, in terms of the greater arc, yeah, I was really disappointed by this. And my suspicions turned out mostly to be true, in that this album seems to be where everything comes off and she's not hiding anything, and she's putting her humanity out in front of her audience for everyone to see. Which makes the fact that the songwriting on this album feels as calculated as it does just feel even more frustrating in context. And it makes a lot of attempts to show this humanity feel really frail at best. And this is probably best illustrated on the title track, where both Pink and Khalid are coming to terms with, yes, being human, it can hurt sometimes. But instead of directly confronting what is hurting them from the outside, they just resort to retreating inward into their relationship, and hence any pathos is just totally lost, obliterated, cannibalized. Even songs like the album standout Can We Pretend still suggest the same unwillingness to confront what's actually going on in favour of just retreating inward into this fantasy world. Although I would argue that the more colourful, vibrant presentation of that song frames it with a more innocent, like childlike context, which I think it works a lot better like that. Then you get songs like the utterly monotonous Courage, which go for vague abstraction regarding the question of whether or not our protagonist has the courage to change, whatever that means. But ultimately it ends up utterly ponderous and boring. But even that song does have one line that definitely is worth pointing out. The line, "I don't have to do this perfectly." There is pathos to the idea that in a world that can often seem so calculated around you, especially in terms of the media industry and what's getting shoved down your throat there, that you feel pressure from all that to try and strive to be that perfect person that you're constantly being presented with, to the extent that trying to convince yourself that you don't need to just becomes a lost cause. But of course, the beautiful irony to all of this is that most of this album is just contributing to the illusion of calculated perfection that is the pop music industry. But on the other end of the spectrum, you get a song like Happy, easily the most conversational of the songs on this album in terms of tone, but also the one that most falls into pandering to the teenage demographic kind of territory. Again, think Jess Glynn. On the song, Pink talks about being insecure with the body that she was given since she was 17, but struggles to talk about her feelings on account of being a cynical bitch, and eventually just comes to the vague conclusion that she's scared to be happy. Yet another example of Pink being totally unwilling to confront her humanity head on, and just talking around it more than about it. My Attic might be marginally better thanks to the more detailed songwriting. Again, I'm not a huge fan of Julia Michaels as a songwriter, but I can admit she does a pretty good job here. But the problem becomes that when it's placed opposite a very similar conceit of Love Me Anyway, where it's just done so much better, that song's just kind of redundant within the greater context of the album. And the fact that Love Me Anyway is framed as a duet works wonders in terms of delivering that conceit, the fact that both partners are asking the same questions. That just raises the stakes in comparison. And on that note, while it might seem like I'm being quite harsh on this album in terms of the writing, there are some moments that really do blow me away, some moments where Pink really does come into her own. I've already talked about Love Me Anyway and Can We Pretend, but I'd be doing a disservice to the album not to mention We Can Have It All. The song about coming so close to achieving your ambitions, but just missing out, leaving you desperately hoping that you might get another chance somewhere down the road. There's a manic energy in the sense of a really bad situation I find irresistible out of this track, and that comes through in both the production and the writing. But sometimes there are no positives to take in a bad situation, and enter Circle Game, probably the best song on the album. The kind of piano ballad tearjerker that Pink sells absolutely beautifully, as she discusses the fact that we should not be scared of dying, but instead celebrate the value of life while we have it, that we have the chance to play. But placing death very much in the subtext of this idea, linking to the concept of her not having this father figure to look up to, and instead now having to play that role for her child, that gives the song a sense of stakes that feels really earned. It's a really excellent track. Certainly unparalleled by anything else here. Probably deserved to be on a better album, to be honest. Maybe one that was actually willing to confront its own humanity rather than rush as fast as it can away from it. And while I do consider this album a bit of a failure on a thematic level, there are enough good songs to redeem this, I can't lie. If you can zone out of the main through line, then I think you'll find a really good pop album. But as it is, yeah, it's decent, definitely passable, but I really get the impression Pink could have done a lot better with this.